What is the nature of consciousness? Why does one thought flow to another? Why is psychic information often symbolic or metaphorical in nature? How does consciousness choose what is important out of the vast array of data available to it? How do we remember? Why are some states of consciousness more conducive to creativity and psi? Is psi an ability? What number am I thinking of? Well, these are some big questions. If you get the answer right, you might get an award, or maybe not. We'll see. But these questions all have to do with a book that we have been reading, First Sight, ESP and Parapsychology in Everyday Life by James C. Carpenter, who's a psychologist and a parapsychologist. He's got this idea, this theory to explain, what psi actually is, why it functions the way it does, and what role it plays in actual, in the creation of consciousness, the construction of consciousness. The title of the book, First Sight, is kind of a playful reference to the idea of, psychic phenomena as a second sight. How we have our first normal sight, which is just, everyday consciousness, and then a second additional sight, which is kind of special. It's like a special ability, something that we might be able to tune into, and maybe something that some people have and others don't. Some are psychics, some are not. Some have abilities, some don't. Some people are just ordinary, normal, average Joes, and then some people seem to have these, remarkable abilities. He says, no, that's not actually right. And the theory is built around the idea that these things that we refer to as psychic phenomena, ESP, extrasensory perception, and PK, psychokinesis, as well as a whole bunch of other, terms that have come into the parlance over the last 100, 200 years, that all of these things come down to a pre-conscious, unconscious process, mental process, psychological process that is going on all the time, and that is actually contributing to consciousness in any given moment, at all moments, and that it is an essential feature that goes towards the construction of consciousness, to the construction of experience. That without it, we wouldn't have experience as we know it, consciousness as we know it, and understand it and experience it. So it's quite an ambitious project to be, attempting so much with a theory. And I found out about this book years ago, and only recently got around to starting to read it. It's a very dense book. There's a lot of information, so it's kind of hard to get into at first. But the ideas in it are so kind of, to me, revolutionary that it seems quite worth it. And maybe to just give a little bit of the background to how he developed this theory, it'll kind of explain why I found it so interesting at the same time. Being a psychologist and a parapsychologist, of course, he'd been looking at all these things for years, since at least the 70s, I think. He's been doing research and encountering various ideas along the way, like the work of Frederick Myers, one of the early psychical researchers in the 1800s, all down through the Rhines and their parapsychological work, and to today, and all the research in between. And along the way, I think in one chapter he gives the main influences on the theory, and he quotes this one psychologist, I think, who borrowed one of Whitehead's terms, prehension, which we've covered in the past. Prehension being coming from the Latin root, I believe, meaning to grasp. So this idea of something about consciousness grasping things, and in kind of almost a literal sense and in the metaphorical sense of when you grasp something, you understand it, but at the same time, when you grasp something with your hand, it's an actual action that you grab hold of something. It's basically saying that there's an analogy to be made in the realm of the mind and consciousness as well. So he's got all these kind of influences leading him in this direction, a lot of it experimentally based, and basically looking at all this data and basically wondering how to put it all together, how to fit it all together so that it makes sense. What's interesting is the conclusions he comes to, because having read Whitehead previously, to give a little background on Whitehead was approaching like a different question. He wasn't a parapsychologist, and he barely ever referenced parapsychology. I think he made like one or two references basically saying he was open to the idea of like telepathy or something like that, and so he wasn't closed-minded about it, but it didn't form an essential part of his actual like philosophy. He was strictly coming at it from the perspective of a mathematician and a philosopher, trying to understand like, you know, why nature works the way it does, why the laws of nature work the way they do, what is like the common feature of all things in the cosmos, like what is, you know, what are the parts out of which the whole is made, what features do they have in common, and how do they apply at each level of like the material physical universe, you know, from subatomic particles up to like beings like humans, individual human beings. And some of the like philosophical like conclusions he came to in order to account for all of the phenomena of life and the universe, and that would include things like minds and abstractions, theories, memories, experience itself, truth. To account for all of these things, he basically came up with a model that's he basically said, well, in order for these things to be possible, there needs to be some kind of non-sensory perception. He called it prehension. So basically, from the very smallest thing to the most large thing, there needs to be some kind of non-sensory like engagement with the world going on, with some modicum of actual experience in the world. And so what Carpenter is saying, he's coming to a very similar conclusion based not on the kind of scientific, mathematical, and philosophical work that Whitehead was doing, but just based on like the psychological studies and just what he's learned being I believe he might be a psychiatrist as well, but basically working with patients and doing like laboratory research on these phenomena. And he basically comes up with this theory. It's based on like two premises. And I'll just kind of summarize the two premises. The first one is that mind is unbounded in nature. So it's not limited, for instance, to the brain or to your physical body. That the mind actually interacts unconsciously with what he calls an extended universe of meaning. That itself is unbounded. It's essentially the entire possible cosmos, the entire universe, everything within it, in space and time. There's this unbounded interaction with that universe of meaning. And that there are both active and receptive processes in this mind on this unconscious level that are intimately conjoined in the formation of any kind of experience. And when you look at an experience, I mean, we like consciousness and the experience of being something, like being a human, is it's holistic in nature. Like there's always a receptive part taking in information from like the world and from yourself, from your own mind, your own imagination, your own memories. And then there's an active like action on the world. We're constantly doing both things. We're constantly acting on the world, acting on ourselves, acting on our bodies, and receiving things from these same sources. And that an essential feature of that mind is what has been called psi, PSI. So ESP and PK. So he would basically say that the active part of that unconscious process would be psychokinesis. It's an action on a physical a physical thing. And then ESP would be a reception, like taking in some kind of information. And then the second premise is that experience and behavior are both made up of purposeful unconscious processes, acting on multiple streams of information. And essentially, those multiple streams of information, according to this theory, are all streams of information. That on some level, the mind, being unbounded, is receiving and somehow sifting through and analyzing all the information available at any given moment. So it's constantly and continually scanning this extended universe of meaning in order to pick out the bits that are relevant. And so says these experience and behavior there are mediated by unconscious intention and contextual appraisal. So on this unconscious level, there is an unconscious intention. So there's a goal or a purpose towards this process to finding that relevant information and what will qualify that information as relevant or not relevant, and a constant contextual appraisal. So what is the relevance of that information in this particular context for my particular aim in this moment? And he says that this is basically what this does is that it rapidly, holistically, and efficiently brings the most useful information to consciousness. And that this is not a mechanical, like strictly biological, mechanical, automatic process. It is automatic in a sense because it's unconscious, but at that level, it is still, it still has to do with things and goals and motives that are personally desirable and what he calls situationally adaptive. So even on this unconscious level, it's not like it's just like a clockwork mechanism going on. At that level, it is still this kind of personal. Well, it's as you can even think about it as if like this process is like, you can think about it like it's a person like within you or something that has its own goals and intentions, and it has its own interaction with the world. You're just not aware of it. But that's the way it acts. It acts as if it does have some kind of agency and intentions, and it's actually doing something. But it's just doing it unconsciously. So it arguably is still you. It's just on a level that you're not personally and consciously aware of. And that the purpose of psi in this view of consciousness and this view of the mind is that what it does is that it is pre-consciously preparing the organism. It's anticipating what will happen. And it then, its function is basically to point this, like give a direction to this stream of like confusing information, to point the organism yourself in the direction that so that you can become conscious of something and do something in accordance with those aims. So like those are the two main premises on which the theory is based. And another reason that I thought it's kind of like a timely time to read this book is that like last year, I think Jordan Peterson had his debates with Sam Harris, which we talked about on a previous show. At least we talked about the first like two of them. They did 4. And one of the points that Peterson has brought up, and he's brought it up several times, not just in this interview, is that there's a big problem of consciousness and understanding it, and how to make sense of the way things work. Because he brings up the example of when you just analyze your experience for a second and you look like vision is actually a mystery, because with all this like light information reaching your eyes and then your brain and your mind, there's so much information that it's not immediately clear why any one thing is more important than anything else. If you like just simplistically try to like program some AI, for instance, like to understand some visual information, it has trouble like differentiating the boundaries of things. It can't identify like a whole as an identifiable whole. You have to program it and say, okay, you have to look for these characteristics, and even then it's a problem, because it is like I can't remember the exact quote, the way William James described like experience. It's basically like this hustle bustle of confusing and a bombardment of sensory data, and it really is a mystery how we make sense of any of it. So that is a mystery, and it's something that like most psychologists and and philosophers and thinkers in general haven't been able to come to terms with, because it is so strange. It seems like there needs to be some kind of like pre-conscious process that will not only like classify the things within like your visual field, for instance, but then to give some weight to the various things in your visual field. Like, oh, that's important. This is more important. Oh, this thing's the most important. Oh, those things aren't important. You can ignore those. So that seems to be the way attention works, right? There's a point of focus in your eye. So like when you're looking at something or someone, there's one bit that's in focus and the rest is kind of blurry. Something can happen in your peripheral vision that you won't even notice. Now, of course, the light from that source is getting in somehow to your brain. You're just not attending to it, and it doesn't register. So the information is there, but something is basically saying, oh, you don't need to pay attention to that. On the other hand, something can happen in your peripheral vision that alerts you, and like, oh, what's that? And so when something like that happens, I've used this example on the show before, in several shows. It's like walking through the forest and you come across like a branch on the ground. and out of the corner of your eye, and you get startled because you think you saw a snake. You might even really think you saw a snake. But so in that initial moment, there's this moment of uncertainty where the stimuli, like the sensory information, is vague. And what your mind seems to do, it seems to make a conclusion before you're even aware of it, that, oh, that is something dangerous, that is a snake, you have to do something about that and get out of the way. So that in itself is kind of like a mystery, how that actually happens. But it does happen. And so what Carpenter's basically doing is trying to explain not only psi, but all of these kind of phenomena. How do we make sense of all of these? Because now, imagine that situation, but he might say, okay, well, imagine that situation, but where you don't get to see the branch, right? You don't get to confirm whether it's a snake or not. Now imagine a situation where you're looking at something. Now you kind of see these in like optical illusions often. So imagine that you're actually in the forest and you see something and you're actually looking at it, and it's from a distance, and so and you can't tell yet if it's a snake or if it's not a snake. So there's this like extended moment or extended period of time of uncertainty and vagueness. In that situation, like you'll have like physiological responses. Your mind will be searching for an answer. It's going to be paying attention. It's going to be like trying to confirm which hypothesis is correct, which like unconscious hypothesis is correct, because you've already come up with a number of possible answers to the question, and you're waiting for the confirmatory response. And in that kind of situation, I think Carpenter would say that the mind can do some interesting things, because there's an analogy to be made to a so-called psychic experience, where. But I think before we get into that, hold that in mind, because I think we need some background before we get into how that actually works. But we'll get there. So.
Yeah, I think that was a really good overview. Like you said, Harrison, the book is really dense, but it's a scientific theory, and so just like a lot of other scientific theory or books about scientific theories, you come over, you get. He covers the territory numerous times. In every chapter, he continues to build on the different theoretical components that he's laid down in the previous chapters. And, especially in the realm of parapsychology, there's just so much information out there that people aren't necessarily exposed to, and to any degree whatsoever. So, we do get this, kind of a caricature of what parapsychologists do, through movies like Ghostbusters and that kind of stuff. But we don't really know what's going on in the field. So it's helpful that he produces a lot of the results of what's going on in the field, and he, wanted to create this theory so that he could explain what was going on. But just to talk a little bit about the structure of the personality that you were talking about, Harrison, and how we construct our experience using our unconscious mind, our preconscious mind, and psi phenomena. So he writes that he uses archetypes to kind of convey this understanding to the ordinary layperson. So the one archetype is the prophet. So this is the psi component of our consciousness, which is constantly in contact with all of this information, and it's trying to sort out what's important. And as soon as it gets something that it's important, the prophet says that towards that. And then after that, after the prophet has made that determination, the artist aspect of ourselves, which is a subliminal kind of sensational type aspect of our psychic machine, you could say, senses that there's something interesting in it, and then starts preparing this preconscious attention, starts sharpening it in the direction of sensory events that will then take that information in. And then after that, you experience a collection of sensations that you attempt to construe. And it's not until the final step that you see X, you see the snake like you were talking about, you see something, and then you get a chance to think about it. So it's this extended self. It's unconscious. Most of it is unconscious. Whatever we are conscious of is just the tip of the iceberg. But it's all still this intentional aspect. It's still intentional. It's whether it's unconscious or conscious, it is your intentions. And so it's really reliant, it seems, on meaningful information. And I think that's also why this theory is so interesting, is that it incorporates this core aspect of meaning into a psychological scientific theory. You go through the book, he discusses the fact that he's not going to talk about neurobiology at all, not because he thinks that that's irrelevant. He thinks that would, it'd be useful to study neurobiology in order to understand, the correlates of different systems with psi phenomena. But the more important thing is that this is a theory about the mind. It's not a theory about neuro, biology, anything like that. It's just strictly about this phenomenological, meaning-focused, intentional system that seems to be able to experience things before they happen, and get vague hunches about things that are happening across time and space, whether that's in the future, whether it's, and it's always meaningful to the participant. So there's a very powerful, important aspect to the theory about what he calls weighting, signing, and switching the information that's, just available out there. And that the psi itself is basically, its job is to sift through all of this information, but it determines whether it is, important to the individual, and then it weights it in terms of whether it's going to be, accessed, brought into consciousness or rejected from consciousness. So it's an interesting way of thinking about the ideas of repression, and how you can just fail to remember something. Well, on an unconscious level, it's not like you are, purposely trying to repress some information, but it's more like your large, more extended self, has this goal, and it deep down, you just don't even want to think about it. It's subconsciously, unconsciously, you're out of all the sea of things that exist, it's just like, well, yeah, sure, but that we're not going to think about that. So we're not going to bring that up to the conscious attention until you reach a point where you have to think about it because your life is falling apart or something like that.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about that too. Maybe first on the bit about repression. He makes the point that it was kind of confusing. It was in a footnote, but he was basically arguing that well, first Freud had said something like that the reason for repression is because you're basically avoiding something that would be too painful to think about. The knowledge of whatever you're repressing would be too uncomfortable. He said, well, he doesn't think that's quite right. He says that that's actually the result of an initial, an initial choosing to know something else. Basically, in that first moment, it's not that you experience something and then there was this process going on to forget it because it would be too painful. It's in that initial moment, the choice was made that because in that context, it didn't align with some motivation, or there was an intention that was contradictory towards that piece of information, towards that event or that conclusion or something. So it was never even really brought to consciousness in the first place, and so he's basically saying that the repression process actually probably starts a bit earlier. I think that's what he's saying. Maybe he gets into it further on in the book, in a part I haven't gotten to, but yeah, it's interesting to think about those things too, because it does explain it provides an account for all of these psychological phenomena that have been recognized for generations, but that there hasn't really been a theory to really account for all of them and why they all work, why they all do the things that they do. But I like the way that he kind of lays it out, and those four stages that you mentioned, Corey, like the prophet, the artist, the scientist, and then the person, the being itself. I want to maybe just expand on that a bit, and the whole weighting and signing. So if you just accept the premises just for a moment of this theory, and then kind of just try to imagine what it would be like. So you've got this mind that is basically coextensive with the universe. All information is there. Now, the problem with that, like Peterson says, is that is too confusing. That's too much information. You can't deal with all information all the time. There's too much work to be doing to be able to to channel that down into some manageable number of bits of data in order to deal with. There has to be some initial sifting going on. So that's basically what Carpenter is saying, is that that initial thing that psi does is to sift out all of the irrelevant information. So it's like there are basic motivations, basic intentions, and kind of like situational individual intentions all going on like on the unconscious level, first of all. And those can be either aligned with or at odds with your conscious intentions. Like you might want to do something consciously and your unconscious has a different idea about it for various reasons. And so at that initial level, there's just an infinite, like huge array of information available to you. So that first step is to say, okay, all this information, like, and this is going on in like a split second, all that information irrelevant. Here's the relevant bits of information. And so that first process is what he calls weighting. So it's like this piece of information is important. These pieces of information not important. Okay, so you've got this important piece of information. Then moves on to the artist. So the artist has this information, and it is important, but it's like now you have to ask some questions about it. Okay, this is important. Now what are we going to do with this? This is where signing comes in, because if a piece of information is important, that doesn't mean that it has to come to consciousness. It might be important in the sense that you have to like repress it, that you don't want it to come to consciousness. To give one example, he talks about like the example of, he kind of like uses a typical almost like evolutionary psychology example, right? Like imagine some early human walking through the forest and there's a tiger like hidden in the bushes. And so what's going on in that situation? He would argue, perhaps, that extrasensorily, by ESP, that person on an unconscious level is aware that tiger's there. Now, what's the adaptive response if that human wants to survive? Now, if that piece of information, which is highly relevant because he might die as a result of that tiger, depending on what he does, if that piece of information becomes conscious, like, oh, there's a tiger there, first of all, it might startle him. It's like, oh, there's a tiger over there, but that might be like a second too late, right? That bit of startling might actually trigger the tiger. It might give him like 1 second less to jump into that cave. So in that situation, you've got extrasensory information about the tiger. You've also got extrasensory information about like a cave nearby. It's like so that what the artist will do, what this signing process will do, is say, okay, that tiger, that's important, like valent information. It's emotionally heightened because it has to do with like physical survival. It's important, but we're going to sign it negatively. We're not going to bring it to consciousness. We're instead going to sign for this cave because it will be more advantageous for this individual to go to the cave as opposed to getting scared of the tiger. So that's just one example he gives for why things can be signed negatively. But it can be for any reason. It's just, simply put, that information, you will be motivated to ignore it for whatever reason. It might be because in that situation there's something more important. In that situation, having knowledge of that information, of that event or that whatever, it will, for whatever reason, go against the most important intention or motivation at that moment in time. So then after that is when the scientist comes along, and because the artist has basically primed these physiological responses, basically preparing for consciousness and preparing for a response. So that's like that would be the first like things that are coming to consciousness, that are like becoming conscious. It's basically so looking at this data and then constructing a picture out of it and like analyzing it and putting it together into a picture, which then gets presented to consciousness. And that's the first actual experience that you have in this situation, where only the relevant information has been coming to consciousness. And what it's actually doing is that information that becomes conscious is the evidence. It is the confirmatory evidence to answer the questions posed by these preconscious processes. Because like at first, this information is all vague. This is another important point about the theory, is that all this like preconscious and like subliminal and extrasensory information, it is vague in nature. It is like a hunch or like just a suggestion of something, because it's suggesting meanings. It's not it isn't a conscious experience. Like when you're conscious of something, you're looking at it. You know you're looking at it. This unconscious psi process is inherently vague and fragmented because you don't have the confirmation of your senses. All you're getting are proposed meanings. It's like, so there's this stream of information coming, and all that your unconscious mind can do is basically say, okay, well that seems to be kind of analogous to, or it reminds me of this, and so it basically, if it comes to like your conscious mind at all, it only comes to the conscious mind in the form of a suggested meaning, a potential meaning. And so that is naturally vague in nature. There isn't anything definite about it. So what's happening in normal consciousness, normal experience, is that's going on. The unconscious is basically making suggestions about potential meanings, and then the actual act of conscious experience is providing the sensory data, the sensory evidence, to either confirm or like disprove that unconscious hypothesis, so to say.
Yeah, I was just going to point out just one thing that I think is important is that he mentions in the book that the psi information, or the kinds of information that you get from psi, are suboptimal. It's not the kind of information that you want to have necessarily, because as a conscious being, you want to know for sure what's going on. You want to be able to label things, understand things, manipulate them. You want to have some form of clarity. But as you said, Harrison, this world of like symbols and meaning is very amorphous, and it's difficult to decipher. So for a lot of people, I mean, they're probably sitting there thinking, like, well, I don't have psi experiences every day. Well, I mean, obviously a lot of people would say that they probably have had them on occasions. They've had hunches, they've had gut feelings, they've had dreams that have, foretold the future. They've made predictions. Obviously it's not something that you can rely on, but it seems like it's this universal hint system, because it seems like from what he said, one of the most optimal times that you will see psi, when you will see psi in your own life, is when you're going through a period of crisis, or when you do not have answers readily available, and you are more open in those instances, because you haven't received like cognitive closure on what's going on. Yeah. You need to have some sort of you're more open, I guess, to these vague kind of general purpose toolkits that will, this is the symbol, this is the feeling, do this, I'm inspired to do this. I guess, rather than just spinning my wheels, it'd be better to go in this direction. And you're more prone to experiencing psi if you are at least in a position of what he calls a lack of cognitive closure. Because as soon as you start working and thinking, and consciously analyzing things, that's when the psi, the psi scores in these studies that he's talking about just nose bomb. They just dive, because people are now consciously thinking, and they're shutting out all of the psi kind of inputs, I guess, into their mind.
Well, the underlying sense I've gotten from what I've read so far is that in trying to create this kind of more holistic understanding and definition of the mind and consciousness, that to eliminate this other perception, that even if it's preconscious or unconscious or going on just in the background, would be to limit our understanding of just how much access to information we have that we'd ordinarily take for granted. And like you were saying, Corey, many of us have had premonitions and dreams and various experiences that suggest that hey, we've just had a psi ability that would seem to be beyond the pale, that goes beyond mere coincidence. So there is already kind of acknowledgement on our part, being a little more open to this idea that we do have access to information, even if we can't facilitate it, even if it's not an ability in the sense that we've been taught to think of it as an ability, but this kind of natural, ongoing, bidirectional process that we might at least become more aware of in their dynamics. And he does get into this in a very rigorous academic way, at least for my sensibilities. But what he's doing, I think, is validating this whole other world of information that that the materialists would have us think doesn't or can't exist. And early on in the book, and this is pretty relevant to our recent discussions in intelligent design and evolution, he just provides what he calls the popular model, which is the way that most of us have been trained and programmed to think about how we function. So I wanted to read that because everything that comes after and even before is in stark distinction to this popular definition. What he says is that in the conventional model of the mind and the world, physical processes are the bedrock of reality. Mental events are generated by physical neurobiological events. Organisms, including human beings, can be understood as biological machines with clear physical boundaries. Because the nervous system generates consciousness, the reality of mental events is secondary and derivative. As the biologist Carl Vogt famously said, the brain secretes thought as the stomach secretes gastric juice, the liver bile, and the kidneys urine. More recently, the astronomer and popularizer of science Carl Sagan expressed the same idea in different words. My fundamental premise about the brain is that its workings, what we sometimes call mind, are a consequence of its anatomy and physiology, and nothing more. Since physical processes produce mental events, these events cannot also be elicited by happenings beyond the physical boundaries of the organism, except inasmuch as their effects somehow impinge upon the sensory system. The laws governing mental processes are mechanical and impersonal in nature. Implicit in this presumption of physiology generating mind is the deeper presumption of a reductionist, quote, hierarchy of the sciences, end quote, in which the constructs of physics are seen as reflecting the deepest substrate of reality. From this point of view, the answer to the question about why the particular next thought occurs must be found in the biophysical events that cause that thought to occur. From the point of view of this model, psi either does not exist, the most intuitively sensible alternative, or else it is an occasional aberration that would require some additions or changes to our ways of understanding just how external events cause mental ones. For example, how the causal activity of an event at a distance might seemingly magically traverse space and give rise to a change in awareness in a nervous system would require some mechanism of action, analogous to an electromagnetic transmission or perhaps a quantum linkage. Since physical events cause mental ones, the rare and anomalous instances of distant influence.
Hold on a sec. No, I think. Go ahead.
Yep. Since physical events cause mental ones, the rare and anomalous instance, speaking of rare and anomalous instances, of distance influence would need to be explained by showing just how those physical events have their impact. So right there, Carpenter really frames the dichotomy between materialist thinking on mind and what he proposes as a more kind of holistic vision. One of the most compelling analogies he makes, I think, in terms of how our mind is interpenetrating the kind of realm of information, is he points out that a gecko can seemingly define gravity by sticking to a ceiling. And the reason it can do this is because it has these tiny kind of tendril-like hairs that merge with the molecules of another solid, the ceiling, so that are there molecules of thought that behave in a similar fashion? It would seem to be so. In any case, it's just another way to, I think, bring our understanding forward in the idea that there is a panpsychism, there is a kind of a cosmic mind that exists that we're that we're kind of working with and aware of on some level all the time. But if you're thinking strictly along the lines of the materialists, with those quotes by Sagan and others, then you kind of close yourself off in some sense to being a receptive being, or at least more receptive, relatively speaking, to these thoughts and ideas that might provide useful information to you.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I think what he does is he brings these kinds of ideas into the realm of the natural. He's basically arguing that we shouldn't think of these things as supernatural or paranormal. It's actually normal. It's a normal feature of consciousness and of the mind, and that's how we should think of it. So we're not talking about some kind of special abilities. This is just the way consciousness works, and if anything, like what he could use to kind of bring the argument home would be like a more expansive like philosophy to back it up. It's not necessary for the book per se, but in order to make a grander worldview, he could bring like Whitehead's philosophy more prominently into play. I think that's just one way of putting all the ideas together. It's like, oh, well, so how do we actually think of this? There is a way of thinking of it to make it all so that it does all make sense. It all fits together into a coherent worldview. But one of the kind of implications of his work here, Carpenter's, I think, is that it's kind of a bad thing to think of psi as an ability. For one reason, one additional reason is that like you might think, oh well, I'm not psychic, so I must be like lesser for some reason. But he's actually arguing that no, these like psi processes are going on all the time for everyone, and actually they are primarily designed for the construction of conscious experience. It's not like you're missing out on much if you're not having these so-called psychic experiences all the time. It's because you technically are. It's just functioning naturally, functioning normally. What's actually happening, like when you do have a so-called experience like that, it's actually when something is going kind of wrong. Not like pathological wrong, but there's just like the process can't complete in its natural way. So he says basically, like in an ordinary experience, when you're consciously experiencing something, it's because all these processes are going smoothly and that consciousness is aligning with those unconscious motivations and intentions as they should. Now, it may be that your unconscious motivations and intentions are at odds with your conscious ones, and that you might want to somehow figure out to get get those two intentions in line with each other. But even if if they're not, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's actually what you're supposed to be doing. That's what the nature of organisms is to have these conscious experiences in order to have, like, let's say the optimal response to an intention. That's all that like consciousness is essentially is like experiencing the world and acting in the world, motivated by these intentions. That's the way things work. It's an interaction and like a communion with the world, and like this relationship with the world that is provided direction by intentions. That's why, like, so free will is a big part of this. It's like, what are your intentions and what are you going to do about them, and how's that all going to play out? And that's essentially what happens, is that it does play out. But now let's look at these experiences, for these like so-called anomalous experiences, for an instant, and kind of get an idea on them. So what Carpenter basically argues is that when these kinds of psi things happen, what's happened is that either the perception or the action has been blocked for some reason. So using the kind of model that we've established, that we've got these potential meanings, potential or these questions that have been asked, and they've brought up potential answers to these questions. But let's say that well, let's use the example of this is a common like psychic experience. That's like an apparition of someone like a loved one who has died like recently. So this is like one of the most documented like spontaneous psi events where a loved one, something bad will happen to a loved one, maybe they die, and then the person, like you, the experiencer, will have a vision of them, either in a dream or it might be like a visual like apparition where you see the person and it's like, or it might just be some significant event, like you look over and your loved one's chair is broken, or some kind of like significant, meaningful event that in retrospect can be tied to that moment of the loved one dying, and you weren't there to basically get the sensory confirmation. That's essentially what's happening. This is a highly emotionally charged event that is highly relevant to you, so based on the theory, you would be receiving this psi information from this distant event that isn't in your immediate environment. But because the perception isn't able to be confirmed by direct sensory experience, it still gets weighted and signed as positive, and it presents itself. It presents an impression to your consciousness that might take a symbolic form, or it might be like a mental imagery. It might be them appearing in a dream. But in that situation, you don't have the sensory confirmation, right? You don't know for sure that your loved one has died. Often in these cases, it's only when they receive the phone call like 5 minutes later or an hour later or a day later that it's like, oh, we've got bad news. And then you say, oh, I had that experience. That was it. And that's when you make the connection. So until you have the actual confirmatory information, it still just remains this kind of elusive, metaphorical, symbolic thing where you're not sure what you just experienced. You're not necessarily sure the significance of it. You've just had this impression. And it might be a vivid impression, but it's still just an impression. It hasn't. It's not like you were. It's not like you perceived it happening. It's not like for an instant you actually saw it happening and you were aware that you were seeing it happening, and it was like having a conscious experience, because it wasn't a conscious experience. It was a preconscious, unconscious priming of your like sensory, of your like mental apparatus, however we think about that. That was the confirmation of which was blocked. And that's why this psi information was kind of given prominence in your consciousness. And that would be an example of the ESP. Now for the PK, the psychokinesis side of it, this would be an action that is blocked. So there's a strong unconscious intention and motivation to complete an action. But for whatever reason, it is that action is blocked. And so what happens is that that action may then be expressed in a kind of symbolic form, but you haven't actually done it. The action completes somehow, but you actually haven't done it. And so the way he puts it is that you can only kind of guess when these things are going on. You're never quite sure. So this happens in terms of any kind of like telepathic impression, or specifically in the context of what he's primarily writing about is these laboratory experiments. So he gives the example, like we'll go back to ESP for a second. All of these tests, testing for ESP in some way. So this might be guessing cards, or what they call a Ganzfeld experiment, where you basically put ping pong balls over your eyes and listen to white noise and basically try to receive a telepathic impression from someone sending you something, and then you have various options afterwards, and you say, okay, maybe I'll go in a bit more detail for this one. So how this works is that you're basically sensorily deprived, and then you have a sender who's basically sending an image. Like they're looking at a card that has a picture on it, and they're trying to send that image into your mind. And then you're just supposed to relax and then just describe anything that comes to mind. So you say, I see seagulls, and I see, a building with a tall spire on it, and et cetera. And then afterwards, they present you with like 5 maybe like pictures. And you say, well, they present you 5 pictures, and they say, which one most looks like the images that came to your mind? And then you say, oh, it was that one. And then you get like extra like raters who who will independently look at the data. They'll look at what you described, and they'll look at the images, and they'll say, "Oh, that's the one that most matches up with what this person says they saw." And so, if it's a hit, then you pick the right picture essentially. And sometimes you rate them, so it's like, oh, this one's the closest, this one's the second closest. Sometimes it might come in second place, and sometimes it might be last. And basically, just using the laws of chance, you'll be able to see that, oh, this person got this amount over chance. So 55% of the time, they should have gotten 50% by chance, and it was 55, or it might be 70%, or whatever. So you can have various degrees of success. But at no point in this process, or in like guessing cards, or guessing what card's going to come up, at no point in that is there certainty. It's always a guess. It's like you are guessing. It's like, okay, I think this one's going to come up. You're never sure. And it's only afterwards when you look at the statistics that you can even tell. And there's nothing really for all these tests differentiating between the way you feel when you get a hit or not. For the most part, if you're just some average Joe taking a test like this, you just guess, and some of them happen to be right, and you're like, oh wow, that's interesting. I didn't know I was psychic. But like the actual psychological process is just a guess. Now, there haven't been as many PK experiments as there have been ESP ones, but there are plenty of PK phenomena that are reported on, and of course there are experiments like trying to affect random number generators to generate more zeros than ones than are statistically expected, or influencing biological systems. So it's I'm going to try to raise that person's blood pressure or heartbeat or the galvanic skin response or something like that. All these kinds of things have been done. But one of the most dramatic examples is what used to be called poltergeist phenomena. So this is usually around a person. It's usually centered around one person, and weird things seem to happen. Objects are moving, etc. What Carpenter would basically be saying is that these anomalous movements of objects, for instance, are actually the expressions of these unconscious intentions and uncompleted actions, uncompleted behaviors. So there's often a psychological significance, a symbolic meaning, a psychological meaning behind these actions. They're often emotionally driven. I think he gives the one example of the one PK subject or poltergeist subject. So the person around whom these phenomena concentrate, that was terrified of objects flying at them and hitting them in the face. And so I think he said that he even witnessed this once, where there's this one person, she was just terrified, and objects are flying around hitting her in the face. And so on an unconscious level, it's again, there's a mismatch. She is consciously fearful of this experience, and then it's something on the unconscious level is causing it to happen. And you can get mismatches like that all the time. But that a theoretical example would be let's say you want to reach for a pencil, and for whatever reason that action is blocked. The way that this would play out in that situation would be that the pencil moves. Now the pencil is moving is because it is responding to that intention, to that meaning, the meaning of the event, the meaning of fulfilling that personal motivation of yours. But you haven't actually completed the action. It is responding. It is basically completing the action on its own. So that would be when you have again, there are famous cases of mediums and psychics who have an object a toothpick or something under a glass case, and they're trying to move it. That would be an example of why and how that happens. Well, not necessarily how, because there's still the question of how does that happen really? That's where you get into more of the philosophy, and that's where David Ray Griffin and Whitehead would step in. But just to round out that PK picture a little bit, what Carpenter is saying happens is that just like ESP is the first sight, it's the first unconscious reception of non-sensory information that contributes to potentially to a conscious experience. PK is the first act. So your mind is basically reaching out to that object already and initiating. It's like this unconscious, like non-physical handshake. There's this relationship between you and the physical object. This relationship between you and the pen, or you and the physical system, biological system that you're trying to interact with in some way. And the first act is basically preparing both you and the object to engage in this little dance, this little causal relationship. And then when that action is blocked, like the intention is still there and the intention is still basically operating. So the act might actually partially complete. But again, it's not a full completion because you haven't actually done it. You haven't grabbed the pencil. So all that is basically just to say, back to my original point, that when things are going normally, there's no need for these kind of dramatic psi effects because you grab the pencil. It's like so you shouldn't necessarily like be pining and longing for psi abilities, because really, if you want to move the pencil, just grab the pencil, right? Basically the mind works fine just the way it is, and these experiences, whatever they are, they happen and they will happen when they're either required or when something is going on that is maybe like pathological to a degree, and in that case, they're signs that something needs to be worked on. Like so in poltergeist cases, for instance, there's signs that there are these emotional problems, these emotional like complexes and things going on that need to be dealt with because they're expressing themselves in these like dramatic, like overly dramatic ways. It's like that's a sign. Okay, well, you need to kind of get your life in order, like figure this stuff out and get a handle on it, because that's not the way things should be working. And again, if these things happen, it's like they will happen when they need to happen, like in a deathbed apparition. It's like if that happens, it's because you simply weren't there to get the sensory information, and it was important enough to come to consciousness. So, on the one hand, I think that it's just a kind of a reminder not to kind of get too obsessed with this kind of thing, because it's really just part of everyday life, and if anything, it's the study of these so-called anomalies that gives us a picture of what the mind actually is, how it actually works. And once we know that, and it's like then you can say, oh well, I've got unconscious intentions and motivations. Well, how does that work? And I guess the question would be, well, it would be to use the hints that these systems are providing, that these processes are providing, to create a picture for yourself of what your self is, what those motivations are, and to be able to see, oh, well, I see why I did that. It's because I really, on some level, I really wanted this to happen, or I didn't want this to happen. And then you can consciously work that through and think about it and say, well, is that what I really want? Because like oftentimes, like these unconscious like desires or motivations, they'll be they might not align with your conscious ones, and so that's just where self-analysis has to kind of come into the picture, so that you can kind of create your own self more consciously, and not just leave it to these unconscious processes, but basically to try to bring them in alignment. And that's kind of the issue. That's kind of the big mystery for me now, is that what are the effective methods for doing this? And I think we've talked about some in the past, but I really kind of want to nail it down now.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big question too, is how do you get yourself in alignment with your unconscious intentions and your conscious intentions? Because as he details it quite a bit in the book, the difference between your unconscious goals versus your conscious goals, and then how the psi phenomena kind of weights and signs things differently, and it's just this wild west for this whole frontier of unstudied reality. But I just wanted to touch on another example of ESP and what they call pre-sentiment. And it was this study that he wrote about that they gave this psychic test, I guess you could call it, to a bunch of 12-year-old students in school. And they gave them a bunch of cards. They laid like I think it was 4 cards down on the table, and then they had a bunch of other cards that they had to maneuver in front of the card that it matched. So, you have 4 sets basically of cards, and they all have to match, but you can't see them. And so these are 12-year-old kids, and unbeknownst to them, under the pictures on the cards are erotic photos on some of them. Not all of them, but some of them are erotic photos. And they tested the kids beforehand to find out how anxious they were, because they wanted to see if anxiety would interfere whatsoever, or how it would correlate with, being able to accurately guess, pretty much using, pre-sentiment ESP, where the cards would go, where they fit. And it turned out that it was significant. It was significantly correlated with missing on the erotic photos, because the more anxious the kids were, to them, they interpreted that to mean that they, on some level, they were signing these as, we don't want to. You don't look. You don't want to know what it is. It doesn't exist. It's signed negatively, or however he would put that. Mm-hmm. And they've replicated those kinds of studies numerous times. Now, these kids, they don't know. They'll never know. They might say, "Oh, you got a relatively accurate score," but to them, it was just pushing cards around. Mm-hmm. In ordinary life, it's something similar, I think. Yeah. You make a choice. You don't know exactly why you made the choice, but something inside of you said, make this choice and not the other one. Mm-hmm. That's how our entire lives are made. And so if you can line up, your conscious intentions with your unconscious intentions, but the problem, I think, is that, like, what if your unconscious intentions are bad? Then who do you turn to? Yeah. What if your unconscious intentions are like, I want to self-destruct? You're like, well, what the, how do I guess you have to go to depth psychotherapy for years and years and years.
Well, I think that's where, like, positive disintegration comes into it, because really, I think what the positive disintegration process is, like Dabrowski would say, it's the construction of a hierarchy of values. And in that process, there are numerous conflicts. That's what the process is. It is positive disintegration. It is things coming into conflict within oneself. It is one aim or intention playing itself out in you unconsciously that is at odds with your conscious intention, and through that conflict, through that struggle, is the creation of the hierarchy to the ideal point where those two things are in line all the time. And where maybe not even in line all the time. There may be times when the unconscious intention is still there, but it is completely at the service of the higher like conscious intention, so that it doesn't control you. Because that's really what it comes down to, is when your unconscious intentions control you. Because there might be an unconscious intention, but it's at least theoretically possible, I think, to have a conscious intention that is stronger. That's not how it plays out. That's not how it plays itself out naturally. Because like Carpenter says, the unconscious intention usually wins out. But I think there's got to be a way where the conscious intention can actually win the game, and that I think that comes with strength of character, maybe. Mm-hmm. But again, like, this stuff is really interesting. It would be interesting to actually do some research along those lines, and to see how these intentions come into conflict and how one wins over the other, what the circumstances are, what can be done to kind of shift the weight of the conscious intentions over the unconscious ones. But maybe just on that topic, I want to read out something he says about these unconscious intentions. It's just 2 paragraphs. So this is in the section called "Why Consciousness." In regard to the guidance of the flow of consciousness, we ordinarily want consciousness to focus on the most useful thing at any given moment. This implicit motive guides the orienting information that is passed on from each perceptual stage to the next. In seeking the most useful thing, we are pursuing a balance of several needs all the time, although different needs may be more salient at different times. Some of these needs are general, and many are shared with all animals. In the case of human beings, it is more adequate to think of these needs as intentions rather than blind forces. So he gives 3 examples of these kind of general aims or motivations. So 1, we want to continue to live, and to live happily and freely. So we also want to avoid potential danger, pain, and confinement. And so this is just a basic basic knowledge for all living things. And you can't argue with that. I mean, things want to survive and do things in order to survive. Can't get around that, really. You can get around it, but it's a very strong impulse. 2, we want to maintain harmonious and fruitful relations with our interpersonal network, so we also want to avoid conflict, shame, and guilt. 3, we want to maintain adequate control over our circumstances and a well-functioning predictive understanding of events. So we also want to avoid confusion, identity diffusion, the invalidation of core constructs, and a loss of freedom to explore and investigate. So right here, we've already got these kind of conflicts, and how all of these intentions can come into conflict, not only with themselves, with each other, and with the more conscious individual intentions as well. So, for example, there is a kind of instinctual intention to avoid the disintegration of one's personality, because it isn't helpful to be in a disintegrated state, right? That it makes you weak, it makes you vulnerable, and so there's a natural revulsion to completely having your worldview shattered. But sometimes your worldview needs to be shattered, right? Especially when it's in conflict with a higher goal, a higher value that you might hold. So this is just one of those examples where these things come in conflict, where on the one hand, positive disintegration is the only way for growth, the only method for growth. And then on the other hand, there is an unconscious aim and intention to avoid that disintegrative process. So naturally, that's going to lead to problems and difficulties, but not insoluble ones. One thing that we haven't really talked about, though, that is kind of really important and that Carpenter focuses a lot of time on, is subliminal processes, because he argues that subliminal processes, which are well studied in psychology, are basically it's the same process going on with psi information. It's just a different source of information. So he gives, for those who might not be familiar with subliminals or primes, an example might be flashing in an experiment, flashing an image, which might be emotionally valent or significant, like the ones you described, Corey, about the cards the 12-year-olds were dealing with. In the 12-year-olds, they didn't actually see the card, but in a prime or a subliminal experiment, that image will be flashed on a screen so fast that you're not consciously aware of it. So subliminal processes actually, it sounds like they shouldn't exist if you have a pre-existing notion of what consciousness is. But these things have been studied for years now and are just generally accepted. So that a bit of sensory information, in the case of visual information, can be flashed so fast that you have absolutely no awareness that you've even seen something. You have no awareness that you've even seen an image. It doesn't register in your consciousness or awareness at all, but it has an effect on you. It might make you physiologically, you'll have a response. You might start sweating. You might start showing signs of anxiety or just emotional perturbation, and you might not even be aware that you're feeling those things, that your body is showing those changes. All these things are going on an unconscious level. And that not only that, but it can change your mood. It can change your ability to do certain tasks. Basically, it can affect your behavior, your emotions, and your cognitive processes, and all totally outside the realm of your conscious awareness. So what Carpenter's arguing is that the same process happens with non-sensory information. That it will affect your emotions, your cognition, and your behavior on an unconscious level, and these would be primarily visible in the examples I gave, where there is a blocking of the perception or the action, and that leads to what he calls inadvertencies. So these would be actions that are inadvertent; they're not intended, but they express some meaning, some unconscious intention. He gives the example of how he's hard of hearing. So he doesn't always hear what people are saying at parties, for instance. So he gave one example where he's at a party and he had a great idea, and so he said, "Oh, like we should do this or something like that, or this is a great idea." And like he looks at his wife, I think, and his wife just gives him the look, oh, he's doing it again. And everyone kind of realizes this because someone else had said that like 5 minutes ago. He hadn't heard it, but either using ESP or just like using his actual hearing but not being aware of it, he had heard that person say that thing. But his conscious experience hadn't registered that as being an actual conscious sensory experience. So what happened was it essentially entered into his mind, and he just had this idea that popped into his head, not knowing where it came from, and he's like, "Oh, that's a great idea," so he said it, having no actual awareness that it had been said by a person before. So that's a kind of example of it could either be subliminal or non-sensory, probably subliminal, but who knows. But there are other examples of that too, like Freudian slips. He gives another funny example of how his daughter's boyfriend had come over one time, and he was working on, like, he was a biologist, biology student, and he was talking about, he said like, "Oh, our lab does great work creating new organisms. I mean organisms." Right? And it's like just a typical Freudian slip, right? Because he had one thing on his mind that he didn't want to come out, and then it inadvertently comes up, in a slightly embarrassing way, or in a very embarrassing way in that case. And this can be, we see these things like in general life all the time, right? It's just the things that leak out, that slip out against our awareness that are expressions of some kind of unconscious process, which are themselves the expression of an unconscious like motivation or intention. And so they can be funny, but they're also revealing because those signs reveal the kind of the hidden aspects of our minds. And I think that's why paying attention to like signs like that, to things, what could you call them? Like the anomalies. Like the anomalies of your behavior, of your thinking. Like an image just pops into mind. Why did that image pop into mind? Well, there was a reason for it. You might not know the reason. You might not ever find out the reason, but it might be useful to kind of look at those things. Why did I dream this and not that? Sometimes there is highly significant information like encoded in dreams, just like in any of these other types of experiences. And they can be, operationalized in a sense too, like in all these experiments, but also in like remote viewing, where it's like, okay, just relax and just describe whatever comes into your mind. We want you to describe, the target in this sealed envelope. Just, relax and just say what you see. So it's not like the person is like aware of seeing that target. It's like, no, images are coming into their mind and they're describing the images. So again, this isn't like a direct conscious perception of the psi information, the psi data, the target. It's just images coming into your mind. It's suggested meanings that the unconscious mind is basically suggesting to the conscious mind. It's like, oh, well, we've got this vague idea of something, and these are the kind of things it reminds us of. And so here, what can you do with this? And then you've got the data, and it's like, oh, well, I see these shapes and a building kind of shaped like this. And if you've got a lot of like background data, you might be really accurate, but you might be just kind of like very accurate. I'll give two examples from remote viewing, like two actual examples, from studies like this. Like one was a woman. It was her first time doing a remote viewing thing, and so it was her task to describe where like another of the researchers was walking with someone else. So they send these people out to just pick a random location, or there's a predetermined location. I can't remember which it was in this case. And she's like, okay, well, I'm seeing it's almost like a tube or some kind of like conveyor of some sort that you walk through, and there's like squares within squares getting smaller. And so she drew this picture of like this tunnel of squares, and where the people actually were was like a an overpass, a walkway over a road, which was encased in kind of like the chain link fence, basically. And so it wasn't squares, but it was kind of more of a an arch shape. But there were like all these arches going down towards it in this tunnel-like shape. So it was pretty accurate, but it wasn't perfect, right? So it was like a suggestion of where they were. It was like a potential image that gave the meaning of those shapes. But then there's an example of Joe McMoneagle, who's a famous remote viewer, who he remote viewed some location. It was some military building or academy or something like that. And he was actually if not a professional, then like an experienced draftsman. So like he understood buildings and he could basically draw architectural diagrams. And so he drew this building almost like picture perfect. And probably, I think, because that was like part of his expertise already. So when the suggested meaning was presented to him, he already had all of these like really specific examples available, so he could put that picture together using that information. Again, still, he wasn't sure. Remote viewers are never sure. Oh, I'm looking at this for sure, and I'm having this direct experience of it. It's no, just what's happening are images coming into their minds, and just to give a couple examples. Anything else?
No, I lost my train of thought on that one. I was listening so intently because I was thinking about Joe McMoneagle. He was a Vietnam veteran, right? And he trained, wasn't he?
I can't remember for sure.
Was he in like the deep state for a while? Wasn't he part of like the Stargate program or something like that? So he had some really good training. And he talks about that in the book, about the the fact that it's not like they were creating these super spies with all of these, intelligence, psychic programs, but they were just finding the natural ability in a lot of people. And then these individuals were learning the various techniques that are required. Like, I think Joe, doesn't he mention the fact that when he is drawing something and he's looking through his mind's eye, quote unquote, you don't say what it is, what you think it is.
Right.
You never say what you think it is. You just say what it looks like or what you're seeing. You can only describe what you're seeing, because as soon as you say what you think it is, then you've committed the act of cognitive closure, and you've basically lost, you're back into your conscious mind, and you're out of that dissociative space from which you're whatever this aspect of your body, the prophet or whatever, is able to, see beyond time and space, and then give you information about what's out there.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you've committed cognitive closure, then you've shut down that communication channel, which is very mind-boggling to imagine. That science right now, even if it's fringe science, I don't know if it is fringe science necessarily. Parapsychology at this time. I mean, it seems like this book is a big attempt to try and make all of these findings coherent and present them to the scientific community. But it fits right in with the intelligent design and all this and all of these other things that we've been discussing. All this real science that's going on concerning things that are fundamentally interesting. They're weird. Clearly, the idea of everybody having some psychic connection to another dimension, and how that basically influences our day-to-day decisions without our knowing necessarily. That's some weird stuff. But when you read the book and you see the studies, the actual studies that are done, and then it's pretty damn convincing.
And this guy kind of reminds me, well, in a different way maybe, but we've all read a little bit or heard about or watched videos of Rupert Sheldrake, and his morphogenetic fields, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly. Just this idea that we do have this kind of extra physical, non-physical communication that is ongoing, that is largely taken for granted, except when the anomaly can't be ignored and is so in your face that after you've kind of dismissed or able to dismiss the idea that it's a coincidence, you're forced to confront this this possibility of a connection to thoughts and ideas and other people in the form of telepathy. If you've ever been close to somebody, you might find that you or them is thinking about or calling each other at the exact same moment. All sorts of different things that suggest the reality of what we're talking about here, what Carpenter is writing about. But getting back to something you mentioned a little earlier, Harrison, in terms of intentionality, one thought was that, like you were saying, and I agree, you don't want to strive for psychic abilities for the kind of experience of it necessarily, or thrill, or the sensation, or the power of it. But at the same time, it would seem to be that if we can openly intend, especially if those intentions are aligned with your higher values, if you can intend for some positive outcome in as detached but objective a way as possible, it would seem, and Carpenter talks about this kind of bidirectional relationship between this information field and our own thoughts and wishes, or intentions to achieve things or act on reality. It would seem as though you can at least make yourself more available to the information that's out there, in some sense.
Yeah, I agree. In the book, he talks about the different kinds of personality traits that go along with being more or less, quote unquote, psychic, and under certain circumstances. For example, he talks about the fact that you want to have meaningful information. Now that's you're seeking after meaningful information, or it's being given by someone that you care about. So, like in a lot of these studies, when you're seeking information from a loved one, you get more hits than you do if you're just seeking information from some random stranger or in the experimenter. Then also the relations with the experimenter in these studies also greatly influences the studies themselves, just because that primes the individual, the relationship. If the experimenter, just cold and just studious and off-putting, then that's going to bias their, that's going to probably, it could create some feelings of anxiety. And as they've shown, a lot of times anxiety reduces your interest in this material because you're thinking or you're worried and it's distracting. And another interesting thing is just believing in psi in general. If you want to become a psychic or whatever, then you're going to believe in psi. But the psi aspect, this profit, that we were discussing, it doesn't impinge on the free will. So people who don't believe in psi are less likely to score on these tests, just because it's not pertinent to them. And it actually would contradict one of their core beliefs.
Right. And so ironically, that might also cause them to do what he calls psi missing. Right. So this would be getting the wrong answer like more than is statistically expected. Mm-hmm. So, again, in this experiment where you might be expected to get 50-50, basically choosing 0 or 1. And so if you get a psi hit, then you might get, maybe 70% or just, or 55 or whatever. But if you've got this strong belief against psi, you might actually get like 70% wrong. So you're actually still demonstrating like a psi ability, but you're getting it in the wrong direction, because on this unconscious level, it does go against that unconscious intention and that unconscious belief. So that to confirm that belief, basically, it's like, oh no, that's bad. We don't want to confirm psi ability. So let's go in the opposite direction. And ironically, it confirms psi ability in quotes, which is kind of interesting. But maybe that brings up one thing. This was the one concept that we had, I think, the most trouble understanding at first, and that's switching. Because we talked about weighting and signing. So weighting is the original, basically ascribing a level of importance to a piece of data. And then signing is whether that will be like incorporated into experience or not. So like we gave various examples of important information that is signed negatively. And one example was that 12-year-old experiment, right? Where the psi information of these erotic pictures was signed negatively. So it's like, no, we're going to ignore that. And then, but the next thing is this switching idea. And that it's a bit tough to understand, but I'll try to describe it. Switching basically accounts for these different types of results that you get in these experiments. So on the one hand, you can have like a strong confirmatory like response where it's like, okay, yes, this demonstrates psi on the positive end. You get you get a lot of hits basically, and then psi missing would be a lot of misses. Also, well, that would be signed negatively. But then you get examples of like long runs of experiments that are just chance, right? Well, on the assumption that these processes are going on all the time, these psi processes, how do you account for all of those different things? Because I just want to find one thing that I wrote to jog my memory. So what did I call it? Yeah, it's called shifting. So shifting is basically what changes the direction of the signing. So you might get a strong, consistent, like stable motivation that would be consistent with psi hits or psi misses. Those are like a positive or a negative signing. But then, for whatever reason, if one of those responses isn't ideal, what he hypothesizes is that the direction is switching back and forth rapidly, basically. So, because there are really only two options when you have like psi information, it's either you go with it or you don't. You turn towards it or you turn away from it. So, just with that in the theory, you'd expect either psi hits or psi misses. You wouldn't expect anything in between. So, I think maybe one of the reasons that he came up with this idea is to explain the chance results, because he explicitly says at various points in the book that even chance results are a result of psi processes, because psi contributes to every event, every behavior, every sensation, every thought, etc. That it is the leading edge, the cutting edge of every mental process. So what happens in like a chance event is when it's switching back and forth, okay, relevant, not relevant, relevant, not relevant, just to balance out, because no response is needed. So it's basically there are three possibilities. There's a positive response, a negative response, and no response. And the way no response comes about is by balancing out the positives and the negatives. So it just switches back and forth, saying it's like a I can't think of the proper analogy, but it's in a constant state of readiness, basically. Switching back and forth, like yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then when you really want no, it's like, okay, no, 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 no. And then you get like a visible, psi miss, a string of psi misses. And then if it's a positive one, if it's something that aligns with the attention, then it's like yes. And so it no longer switches back and forth. It stabilizes in the opposite direction, in the yes direction, and that's when you get a hit. That's when something contributes to experience, as opposed to being blocked out and to being ignored, essentially.
Yeah, I think he used the analogy of the boxer, right? He's shifting weight.
Yeah, that's
he's
right.
not just standing there waiting to get punched in the face. He's shifting weight so that he's agile and ready to throw a punch as soon as the shot. So yeah, I was saying that belief in psi. So belief in psi was an important contributor to actually experiencing these psi events. And then also he has in a chapter about extroversion, which is really interesting, because one of the biggest findings in parapsychology is that extroverts have more psi than introverts. And he breaks this down for a number of reasons, but one of them is just in terms of what motivates extroverts versus introverts. And the kinds of studies, how they set these things up, might motivate an extrovert more than an introvert. And so they've even done some studies on, you test people for their extroversion or introversion, and then you put them with, someone of the opposite sex, and then they score better, because they're motivated. They want to score better, so they do score better. Whereas an introvert, you put them in, and maybe they don't care. They're not interested. Maybe they're even a little bit put off by,
anxious.
or anxious. They're anxious. But when you put an introvert into like what you were describing, the Ganzfeld test, where they sit with golf balls over their eyes, and all they do is they listen to the white noise, and they just drift into their stream of images. That's where the introverts actually excel, and extroverts just don't score as high, which I thought was really interesting, because it's one of the bigger findings, I guess, is that extroverts typically score more. But then according to this study, well, it makes sense because their motivations are different. Introverts are more motivated to look within and to ponder, and extroverts are more interested to be, partying, according to, the colloquial, the center of attention. Yeah, so extroversion was found to be, and introversion, both relevant depending on the context. And an openness also was important, because as he describes it, open people are probably more likely to find the information from psi more interesting, more intriguing, whereas people who aren't as open are going to find it dubious. It's not necessarily a disbelief in psi, but it's maybe more of a disbelief in its relevance. If you've got if you're a more traditional, conservative type individual, you like to, you're an engineer, you like to be consciously manipulating things with your mind and figuring out things, maybe that kind of information you're going to find less trustworthy. So if you're higher in openness, you're more likely to be better at psi. And then also creative people have been found to be a little bit more psychic than others, but only under certain circumstances, like creative people in the sense of like artists and people who have what he called intentional stability. So you can't just be I just draw art, I feel like I'm creative, I feel like I'm psychic. No, you have to be somebody who has this stability of intention that drives and and then follows through with an actual creative work. Those individuals are more likely to be psychic, or to be exposed to this kind of psychic information. And it makes sense too, because a lot of their work is drawing on this inner world of images, of
potential
narratives, meanings. Yeah, that's most of their work. So they live in that. So of course it would be meaningful and relevant to them. And yeah, that's pretty much sums up a lot of the actual like personality and anxiety too. Obviously, anxiety was a sign of, or if you were more prone to be more anxious, you were actually more likely to sense negative events coming. But you're still on other tasks. You're just too scared of information you don't want.
Yeah, because what I got in one of the early chapters was that anxiety basically leads to avoidance. Mm-hmm. Because if you're an anxious person, you're more likely to avoid any potentially disturbing information. So that actually mostly dampens psi effects, because all this psi information might be potentially anxiety inducing. Mm-hmm. So it's like he basically says some of the best states to be in for to be conducive to this kind of process is to be like in a state of openness, not to be thinking about anything in particular, to kind of just have this free flowing thought process, not to be anxious, to be relaxed, and to basically and to have a wish, to have a strong wish for something to happen. So I think we've gone on long enough today. So we'll be coming back to this book again in the future. I don't know, maybe next week, maybe the week after that, to continue talking about it. But I just want to thank you all for tuning in and watching if we put this one up on YouTube. So if you see this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and like and leave comments. They can be either positively signed or negatively signed, and then we will either choose to bring them to consciousness or not, depending on if we like them or not. So thanks, everyone.
Have a great week, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.